Miss Harding, I've searched this kingdom for a woman worth trusting.
Your Grace, surely you mean someone else.
No.
I mean the woman who stood alone.
In the grand ballrooms of high society, a woman's worth is measured in dowries and delicate smiles. Clara had neither. She was the spinster sister, the invisible chaperone, the running joke, until the richest man in the kingdom walked past every diamond of the season and bowed to her. The rented carriage smelled faintly of damp straw and cheap soap, a sharp contrast to the lavender water Clara had aggressively sprayed on her younger sister's wrists. Clara sat with her back ramrod straight against the cracked leather seat, the dim light of the street lamps catching the worn fibers of her dark navy gown. She had dyed it herself 3 days ago in the kitchen sink, hoping the dark hue would mask the fact that the style was 6 years out of fashion. Across from her, 18-year-old Charlotte Lottie was a vision in pristine white silk. The silk had cost the absolute last of their late father's meager army pension. Clara's own fingertips were still raw and pin-pricked from sewing the delicate lace trim onto the bodice well into the dawn hours. "I feel sick," Lottie whispered, clutching her stomach. "What if no one asks me to dance? What if we are ruined?" "Clara, you are beautiful," Clara said, her voice a steady, low anchor in the rattling dark. She reached out, gently smoothing a stray blonde curl from Lottie's forehead. "You will smile, you will nod, and you will not mention the leaky roof at home. You will be asked to dance. I am certain of it." "And you?" Lottie asked, her large blue eyes shifting to Clara's plain, practical face. Clara offered a tight, reassuring smile. "I will be exactly where I belong, by the potted palms, guarding our cloaks." At 26, Clara was entirely aware of her place in the world. She possessed none of Lottie's soft edges. Her jaw was too sharp, her dark eyes too observant, and her tongue, when she forgot to bite it, was far too quick for polite society. More importantly, she had no dowry. In a society that traded women like thoroughbred mares, Clara was an aging cart horse, good only for carrying the burdens of others. The carriage lurched to a halt outside the assembly rooms. As soon as they crossed the threshold into the blinding glare of 1,000 beeswax candles, the social machinery took over. The heat of the ballroom hit them like a physical blow, thick with the scent of heavy perfumes and roasting meats. Within 10 minutes, Lottie was swept onto the floor by a young lieutenant. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She retreated to the edges of the room, blending perfectly into the heavy velvet drapes. An hour passed. The arches of Clara's feet began to ache in her stiff, hand-me-down shoes. She occupied herself by observing the room, silently calculating the cost of the jewelry on display and translating it into how many cords of winter firewood it could buy. It was during a waltz that Lord Harwood approached the refreshment table, just a few feet from where Clara stood hidden by a marble pillar. Harwood was the second son of an earl, handsome in a polished, entirely self-aware sort of way. He was speaking to a companion, their voices raised over the string quartet. "The younger one is flawless," Harwood said, tossing back a glass of port, "like a porcelain doll. I intend to call on her tomorrow." "You'll have to get past the dragon at the gates," his companion laughed. "The older sister, they say she's entirely unmarriageable, a permanent fixture." Harwood snorted, a cruel, dismissive sound. "The spinster tax. I suppose if I take the girl, I must take the gargoyle as well. No matter. I have an estate in the north with a drafty dower house. I can put her there. Out of sight, out of mind. A small price to pay for the prettiest girl of the season." Clara did not gasp. She did not weep. Years of poverty had burned the fragility out of her. Instead, a cold, hard knot tightened in her chest. She stepped out from behind the pillar, the heavy fabric of her dyed gown rustling softly. She walked directly to the table, poured herself a cup of lukewarm lemonade, and turned to face Lord Harwood. "A drafty dower house in the north sounds wonderfully bracing, Lord Harwood," Clara said, her voice quiet but ringing with perfect, crystalline diction. Harwood stiffened, the blood draining from his face as he realized she had heard every word. However, Clara continued, taking a slow, deliberate sip from her cup, considering the staggering debts your family has recently accumulated at the faro tables, I severely doubt you could afford to put a new roof on that dower house. And as I possess a rather delicate constitution when it comes to dampness, I must respectfully decline your generous offer of exile. Harwood's mouth opened and closed like a landed trout. His companion looked away, desperately studying a crack in the ceiling. You overstep, madam," Harwood finally stammered. "No, my lord," Clara said smoothly. "I merely calculate. Have a pleasant evening." She turned her back on him, her spine rigid, her chin high. As she walked away, a low, rich sound cut through the tension. It was a laugh. Not a polite society titter, but a genuine, chest-deep chuckle. Clara snapped her gaze to the right. Standing in the shadow of the alcove, entirely alone, was Henry Cavendish, the Duke of Rothwell. He was not a man one would call conventionally handsome. His face was weathered, his shoulders broad, beneath a severely unadorned black evening coat. There were premature lines etched around his eyes, the marks of a man who carried the weight of massive estates, endless responsibilities, and, rumor had it, a profound boredom with the world he ruled. He was the wealthiest man in the kingdom, and the most elusive. Presently, his dark eyes were fixed squarely on Clara. He held up his glass of scotch in a silent, mocking toast to her. Clara's jaw tightened. She did not blush. She gave him a short, dismissive nod, turning her attention back to the dance floor to find her sister. She did not have time for the amusement of dukes. She had a family to keep afloat. 3 days later, the rain was relentless. It sheeted against the tall windows of Lady Abernathy's sprawling country estate, turning the sprawling lawns into a gray, muddy marsh. The weekend party had been Lottie's first true invitation into the inner circles of the elite, and Clara had spent the last 48 hours fetching discarded shawls, nodding politely at veiled insults, and making sure Lottie did not drink too much champagne. By Tuesday afternoon, the forced confinement of the house had driven the guests to a fever pitch of restless gossip. Seeking refuge, Clara slipped away down a long, drafty corridor until she found the estate's neglected conservatory. It was a vast, glass-domed room, smelling heavily of damp earth, rotting leaves, and the faint, sweet decay of overwatered orchids. It was imperfect, forgotten, and blessedly silent. Clara found a wooden stool by a long potting bench. She unbuttoned the cuffs of her severe gray day dress, rolled her sleeves up to her elbows, and picked up a rusted trowel. A row of struggling ferns sat on the edge of the bench, their roots tightly bound in pots, far too small for them. With methodical, practiced movements, Clara began to loosen the dirt, freeing the tangled roots. She was halfway through the second fern when the heavy oak door groaned open. Clara didn't look up, assuming it was a servant fetching firewood. "There is a draft," she said quietly. "Please, shut it." The door clicked shut. The heavy tread of boots echoed on the stone floor, far too measured to be a footman in a hurry. Clara looked up. Henry Cavendish stood at the end of the aisle. He looked entirely out of place amidst the dying flora. He wore a heavy riding coat, the shoulders dark with rain, and his leather boots were caked in thick, yellow mud. He looked less like a duke and more like a tenant farmer who had just walked off the moors. Clara wiped her hands on a coarse linen rag, her heart giving a strange, irregular thump that she immediately blamed on surprise. "Your Grace, if you are looking for the billiards room, you have taken a rather profound wrong turn." Henry didn't smile. He walked slowly down the aisle, his dark eyes scanning the ruined plants before resting heavily on her. "I was looking for quiet. I found the house to be entirely infested with people." That is generally the nature of a house party. Clara noted dryly. Henry stopped opposite her, leaning his forearms against the high potting bench. The scent of rain, damp wool, and leather drifted across the table, sharply masculine and grounding. He looked at the pile of dirt, the rusted trowel, and then at Clara's bare, soil-stained forearms. No lady ever showed her forearms. Clara knew she should roll her sleeves down immediately. She didn't. "What are you doing to those weeds?" he asked, his voice a low gravel. "They are ferns, Your Grace, and I am repotting them. They have been left in containers far too small for their root systems. They are suffocating." Henry watched her hands. They were not soft. There were faint calluses on her thumb from the sewing needle, and a small burn mark on her wrist from an iron. He did not look at them with the revulsion Clara expected. He looked at them with sharp, unblinking intensity. Some would say it is a waste of time to salvage something that has already begun to wither, he observed. Clara picked up a handful of fresh, dark loam and packed it around the base of the plant. Some people lack the patience for anything that does not bloom immediately. Things that survive neglect often grow the strongest roots, provided they are finally given the space to do so. Henry let out a slow breath. He reached out, his large, ungloved hand brushing against the fronds of the newly potted fern. "You have a very practical view of the world, Miss Clara. Poverty breeds practicality, Your Grace. I leave the poetry to my sister." Clara met his gaze squarely. "Speaking of my sister, she is currently in the drawing room. If you hurry, you might catch her before Lord Harwood asks her to turn pages for him at the piano." Henry's brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his face. "Why would I care where Lord Harwood is?" Clara sighed, picking up another pot. "Please, let us not play parlor games. You are the wealthiest unmarried man in the country. My sister is the most beautiful girl of the season. It is the natural order of things. You observe her. She pretends not to notice. I merely offer you a shortcut. You think I followed you into a freezing greenhouse to ask about your sister? I cannot fathom why else you would be standing in the mud ruining a perfectly good pair of boots." Clara shot back, her defensive walls snapping firmly into place. She was used to being the toll bridge men crossed to reach Lottie. She accepted it. This, Prive. But for some reason, having the Duke do it felt like a heavy stone settling in her stomach. Henry didn't answer immediately. He walked around the edge of the potting table, entirely ignoring the dirt, and stopped less than 2 feet from her. Clara had to tilt her head back to look at him. Up close, the silver threading through his dark hair was visible, as was the sheer exhaustion in his eyes. "I own 80,000 acres in the north," Henry said quietly, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in Clara's chest. "I have 300 tenant families who depend on my land management. I spend my days reading crop yields, calculating timber exports, and arguing with stewards about drainage ditches. When I come south to these God-forsaken gatherings, I am surrounded by women who think wheat grows in neat little bags at the baker's shop." He reached out. For a terrifying second, Clara thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, his long fingers gently tapped the spine of a leather-bound book she had used to prop up a broken table leg. It was an agricultural almanac. "I do not want a porcelain doll, Clara," he said, using her first name with a casual intimacy that made her breath hitch. "I want someone who knows how to dig her hands into the dirt and fix what is broken." Clara stood frozen. The air in the greenhouse suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He wasn't looking past her. He wasn't looking for Lottie. He was looking directly at her, seeing the sharp edges, the poverty, the calluses, and he was not turning away. Before she could formulate a response that wasn't incredibly foolish, the shrill sound of Lottie's laughter echoed from the open window of the manor house above them. The sound shattered the fragile, heavy silence. The world rushed back in the reality of her worn dress, her lack of dowry, the absurdity of a duke speaking to a spinster in a ruined greenhouse. Clara stepped back, hastily pulling down her sleeves and fumbling with the buttons. I must return. My sister needs me. She is liable to agree to a carriage ride with Harwood if I do not intervene." Henry's jaw clenched. The open, vulnerable look vanished, replaced instantly by the impenetrable mask of the Duke of Rothwell. He stepped aside, giving her a stiff, formal bow. "Of course," he said coldly. "Do not let me keep you from your duties." Clara fled. She hurried across the wet lawn, her boots soaking through, trying desperately to ignore the terrifying realization that for the first time in her life, she deeply resented her duty to her sister. Because for 10 minutes, in a damp, decaying room, she had felt entirely seen. And she knew, with grim certainty, that she would have to spend the rest of her life pretending she hadn't. The butcher's bill sat on the scarred wooden table of their rented lodgings, a single piece of parchment that spelled absolute ruin. Miss Harding stared at the harsh black ink, the numbers blurring together in the weak morning light. 4 shillings. That was all that remained in the tin box beneath her mattress. The London season was ending in 2 days with the Royal Assembly, and they were drowning. Across the cramped room, Lottie sat by the window, oblivious, humming softly as she mended a tear in her white silk glove. "Lord Harwood said he has a surprise for me tonight at the Assembly," Lottie murmured, her cheeks flushed with a naive, terrifying hope. "He asked me to meet him on the South Terrace before the midnight supper. Do you think he means to ask for my hand?" Miss Harding closed her eyes. The cold knot that had lived in her chest since she was 16 pulled tight. "Lottie, men like Harwood do not propose on unlit terraces. They propose in drawing rooms to fathers and solicitors. The terrace is where they take girls they intend to destroy." Lottie dropped her glove, her blue eyes wide and defensive. "You are being cruel. Just because you have given up on the world does not mean everyone in it is wicked. He is a gentleman." "He is a vulture," she replied flatly, folding the butcher's bill and sliding it into her pocket. "And we are bleeding. You are not to go near the South Terrace tonight. You will stay in the light. You will stay where I can see you." Lottie turned her face to the glass, her silence heavy and petulant. When they arrived at the Royal Assembly hours later, the heat and noise were suffocating. The ballroom was a sea of velvet, diamonds, and predatory calculations. The chandeliers dripped with thousands of wax candles, casting a glaring light that offered nowhere to hide. Miss Harding took her familiar post against the brocade-covered walls. Her dyed navy gown was fraying at the hem, the fabric heavy and oppressive. She kept her eyes locked on Lottie, who was immediately swept into the crush of dancers. For 2 hours, she stood vigil. The arches of her feet screamed. The smell of expensive musk and roasting pheasant made her empty stomach cramp violently. Then, during the chaotic transition between a quadrille and a waltz, she lost sight of the white silk dress. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of her throat. She pushed away from the wall, weaving through the dense crowd of aristocrats, ignoring the indignant huffs of dowagers as she bumped their shoulders. She checked the refreshment tables. The card room, the portrait gallery, empty. She turned toward the heavy glass doors leading to the South Terrace. The night air hit her like a wet towel, thick with fog and the scent of crushed roses. She squinted into the gloom, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path. A sharp, frightened gasp broke the silence. Miss Harding broke into a run. Behind a towering stone fountain, she found them. Harwood had Lottie backed against the damp masonry, his hand gripping her wrist, entirely too tight. Lottie was trembling, her earlier defiance replaced by sheer, wide-eyed terror. "Let go of her," Miss Harding said. Her voice did not shake. It cut through the fog like a sharpened blade. Harwood whipped his head around. When he saw it was only the spinster sister, his tense posture relaxed into a sneer of pure malice. He did not release Lottie's wrist. "Ah, the gargoyle," Harwood drawled, his breath reeking of brandy. "Right on time to ruin the evening. Let her go, Harwood, or I will scream so loudly the king himself will come out here to investigate," she stated, taking a slow, measured step forward. Harwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Scream. Please, let them all come. What do you think they will see? I will simply tell them, your desperate little sister begged me to meet her here, threw herself at me, and demanded I compromise her, because you are entirely out of funds. He leaned closer to Lottie, who whimpered. Who will society believe? The son of an earl, or two starving nobodies living in a slum? The brutal truth of his words hung in the damp air. Society would eagerly tear Lottie to shreds. They would be ruined, out on the streets. What do you want? Miss Harding asked, the words tasting like ash. Harwood's eyes gleamed with sadistic triumph. I want you to get on your knees in the mud, right now. Beg me to spare her. And then, I want you to walk back into that ballroom, pour a glass of red wine over your own head, and walk out. A little entertainment for my trouble. Lottie sobbed, a pathetic broken sound. No, please. Miss Harding looked at the muddy ground. She looked at the expensive leather of Harwood's shoes. She thought of the butcher's bill. She thought of the 4 shillings. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. Slowly, agonizingly, she gathered the heavy skirts of her faded gown, preparing to lower herself into the dirt. I severely doubt the mud will improve the look of that gown. The voice came from the deep shadows to their left, low, guttural, resonant, with absolute, unyielding authority. Harwood froze. Henry Cavendish stepped into the pale moonlight. He wore immaculate formal attire, but there was nothing civilized about the way he moved. He walked toward them, with the slow, deliberate gait of an apex predator. His dark eyes were fixed entirely on Harwood, cold and utterly devoid of mercy. Rothwell, Harwood stammered, his hand dropping from Lottie's wrist as if burned. We were just— I heard exactly what you were, Henry interrupted, not raising his voice. He didn't look at Lottie. He didn't look at Miss Harding. He stopped inches from Harwood, towering over the younger man. You are a coward who preys on those you believe lack protection. It is tedious, and I despise tedious men. Harwood puffed out his chest, attempting to salvage his fractured pride. This is a private matter between myself and these women, Your Grace. It does not concern you. Henry tilted his head, a slow, terrifying smile touching the corner of his mouth. Everything in this kingdom concerns me, Harwood, including the £85,000 your father owes my bank. A debt I intend to call in tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Harwood's face drained of all color. He looked as though he were going to be violently ill. You cannot. I assure you, I can, Henry said softly. Now, walk away. If I ever see you look at either of these women again, I will not stop at your father's bank accounts. I will dismantle your entire bloodline. Do you understand me? Harwood didn't speak. He gave a jerky, terrified nod, turned on his heel, and fled into the dark. The heavy silence of the terrace pressed in on them. Lottie was crying silently, her hands covering her face. Miss Harding stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched Henry turn his back to the path where Harwood had fled. Slowly, he looked at her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't ask if she was unharmed. He simply looked at the mud on the hem of her dress, and then up to her sharp, exhausted face. Take your sister home, Henry said quietly. The season is over. He turned and walked away before she could utter a single word of thanks. 2 nights later, the season reached its absolute zenith at the Duchess of Richmond's grand finale ball. It was an invitation-only affair, reserved strictly for the highest echelons of power. Miss Harding had managed to secure Lottie an invitation weeks ago, though she had intended to stay in the carriage, but Lottie had refused to go alone. The encounter with Harwood had shattered her illusions. She clung to her older sister's arm as they walked up the grand marble staircase, stepping into a ballroom that rivaled the sun in its brilliance. They had barely crossed the threshold when the whispers began. Miss Harding felt the shift in the air immediately. She saw the side glances, the fans snapping shut, the mocking smiles of the dowagers lining the walls. Harwood had not kept his mouth shut. Humiliated by the Duke, he had clearly spent the last 48 hours spreading venom, branding them as desperate, scheming women who had tried to trap him on a dark terrace. "They are looking at us," Lottie whispered, her grip tightening on Miss Harding's arm. "Keep your head up," she ordered, her spine snapping straight. "Do not let them see you bleed." But the crowd was parting. Across the polished floor, Harwood was holding court with a group of young lords, laughing loudly and pointing directly at them. The music seemed to fade into the background as the collective gaze of 200 aristocrats turned toward the two sisters standing isolated near the entryway. They were marked for slaughter. The social execution was absolute. Miss Harding prepared to turn around. She prepared to march Lottie back out the doors, into the cold night, and figure out how to survive the ruin tomorrow. Then, the massive double doors at the far end of the ballroom slammed open. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The chatter died instantly. Henry Cavendish walked into the room. He did not stroll. He marched. The sea of aristocrats instinctively parted for him, a wide avenue clearing across the center of the ballroom. He wore the stark black and white of supreme mourning or absolute dominance, his presence sucking the oxygen from the vast room. He bypassed the royal dukes. He ignored the stunning daughters of earls, batting their eyelashes. He did not even glance at Harwood, who had shrunk back against a marble pillar, looking physically ill. Henry walked the entire length of the ballroom, his heavy boots sounding in the dead silence, until he stopped directly in front of Miss Harding. The entire kingdom watched, holding its breath. Henry looked down at her. He saw the frayed edges of her dyed gown. He saw the defiant, terrified set of her jaw. And then, he lowered his broad shoulders and executed a perfect, deeply respectful bow, a bow reserved only for royalty. "You did not wait for me to escort you in," Henry said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. Miss Harding stared at him, her chest heaving, entirely unable to process the magnitude of what he was doing. "Your Grace?" Henry held out his large, calloused hand. "I believe," Henry said, loud enough to rattle the crystal in the chandeliers, "we have a great deal of business to discuss regarding the management of my northern estates, and I require a duchess who knows how to fix what is broken." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Fans dropped. Lottie let out a tiny, shocked squeak. Miss Harding looked at his outstretched hand. She looked at the man who saw past the dirt, the poverty, and the armor she had worn for a decade. She placed her raw, pin-pricked fingers into his palm. His grip was warm, solid, and utterly immovable. As Henry led her directly to the center of the floor, pulling her into his arms for the first waltz, Miss Harding looked over his shoulder. She caught Harwood's eye, watching the man shrink into nothingness. She wasn't the invisible chaperone anymore. She was the most powerful woman in the room. Did you enjoy this story of ultimate poetic justice? There is nothing more satisfying than seeing true grit recognized and arrogance put in its place. If Jane and Henry's uncompromising romance kept you listening until the very end, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow historical drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us what you want to see next. Your support helps bring these serialized stories to life every single week.